I don't know how many times we've been through this, but I've always said and always maintained that one of the things the UK public would very, very much come to regret in their post Brexit malaise would be regulations. Regulations are massively important. Not only does it protect consumers, it protects workers, it stops companies from cutting corners, which would again damage potentially environment, all kinds of different sectors. But also, if we are, and our largest trading partner, still Europe, by the way, that, as we always said, wasn't going to change. If they have certain regulations, if we want to continue trading with them, we've got to match their regulations. Doesn't matter what ours are. We've got to, if we want to trade and send goods to their country, we've got to match their regulations. And of course, they're our closest trading partner. They're our largest export market. They're also our largest import market as well. Probably going to be hearing a lot about that within the coming year, as well as maybe, if the government doesn't, of course, skip it another time, we might have more Brexit checks. This time, not going into Europe, but coming this way, which is going to increase the time that these huge bottlenecks that are being currently caused, and of course the queues at Dover, and don't just because they have not been in the news does not mean that they haven't been happening. Oh no, they are still there. The average wait time for a lorry going from the UK to Europe has dramatically increased. And of course, now that we're going to have checks coming in this way, potentially starting from next year as well, that is going to hugely increase waiting times and cause huge problems that we are going to see unfold, that the government is going to be desperately trying to deny and say that somehow it's all the French border fault problem. When in reality, no, this is a UK border problem. Always has been, always would be. But when it comes to sort of regulations, they are massively important. And it is something that the UK public, because we have been part of Europe, sort of ignored completely. And of course, lapped up all the ridiculous stories that are produced about, bendy bananas, etc., etc. You can, name them off the top of your head. The one point that they were going to stop selling pints in UK pubs at one point. Again, none of those stories back from that time of when we were in the EU and when they were sort of, farming them out constantly never even happened and weren't even true. So now that we're out, especially regulations and standards are massively important. And one of the big things that has been happening is that the EU has been continually, as it always does, march and change and keep in step with its standards and regulations. And one of the big problems is that we have had a UK government that is not interested in regulations. It wants to deregulate. But it knows that it can't, shall we say, fully get away with these regulations that it would love to do. So instead, it just decides, well, tell you what, instead of bringing in new regulations or getting rid of regulations, we're not actually going to do anything. Although sometimes there have been significant deregulations that we have seen, especially in the chemical industry, causing massive problems. We talked very recently about the agricultural runoff rules that are going to be changing. That's going to cause huge environmental problems to sort of all of the UK's rivers. We got big problems coming, and I think the UK public is going to wake up to the fact that, oh, actually, regulation's kind of important. Very boring topic of subject to talk about and listen sometimes, but these things kind of important, kind of do have a lot of effects on our economy, on the products and the environment around us, from that to sort of workers' rights. So it is really important that maybe we keep up with these EU standards, especially if they're our largest trading partner still and our export market. Sort of kind of important that we keep in step with them to make sure we are the same. But no, unfortunately, post-Brexit UK has been drifting from EU standards, and as a result is also making it incredibly harder to now trade with the EU. And The big reason why we joined sort of the beginning of what would become the European Union in the first place was because businesses were screaming about all these opportunities that they were missing out on for not being in Europe and being part of that regulatory regime that was at the start just being built. And eventually would, of course, become the single market, helped very much be created by Margaret Thatcher. You know, history has a bizarre way of repeating itself. But of course, that is what we're going to hear from today. Businesses complaining about all the opportunity and the fact that the UK is not keeping up with what's going on in Europe. And as a result, trade is getting harder. They are losing out on business. They are losing out on contracts. It doesn't matter that we have all these quote fantastic trade deals, or we're part of the comprehensive trade and Pacific Partnership. Doesn't matter. Europe is on our doorstep. That is always going to be our largest, most direct trading partner. And ignoring that means specifically it will damage our economy. That is another thing that when eventually we do go to rejoin, that is eventually part we will see. And as we said, eventually we're probably going to end up going, oh, well, first of all, we'll join the customs union, then we'll end up rejoining the single market, and then eventually we'll become full EU members again. And as we will say all the time, what was the point? Because honestly, what was the point of Brexit the second we joined the customs union? So, before we do go getting into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. There's the YouTube thank you button. And of course, there is the Pony Club down below as well. So let's crack on into this. This comes from The Guardian with the title of "We're Out of Step, How Post-Brexit UK is Drifting from EU Standards." When the government announced this year that it would be indefinitely delaying its plans to force UK companies to adopt a new post-Brexit quality mark, the UKCE, Simon Blackham of the insulation maker Rachel was delighted, saying, "Yes, an outbreak of common sense," he recalls thinking. His joy, however, was short-lived. It quickly emerged that the government's change of heart did not apply to construction products, such as his insulation panels that it manufactures in Stoke-on-Trent. Within the next 18 months, the Belgium-owned firm expects to have spent around £400,000 just in UK retesting its products to comply with the new regime. Think about that. It's had to spend over £400,000. That is a lot of money. That is a lot of money just to get your products retested, just to satisfy this UK regime. It's a lot of money that many businesses are just going to go, why are we paying that? We've got this massive market already in Europe. Why are we paying this amount of money just to be able to sell into a UK market that is not that big comparatively to the European one? This is, of course, an increasingly common story. 3 years on from Brexit, as the government celebrates leaving the EU's complex regulatory regime, many firms are finding the peculiarities of divergence costly and confusing, and business groups say it is only going to get worse. What did we say about this from the very, very beginning? If you know and you followed this story from the very beginning, you know we have covered business after business after business on this channel, not only this year, but last year, all the way going back to 2016, of all these businesses, not big multi-international companies, but SMEs, saying, how are we going to adopt? We're going to have to completely forego our, the European market, which means losing 30 to 40% of our business. That's not good. That is not good for UK companies at all. So chemicals are yet another case in point. Since January of 2020, the UK has failed to ban 36 pesticides that are now not allowed for use in the EU. Blackham also wearily explains the construction products are overseen by Michael Gove's housing ministry, not Business and Trade Department, which issued a statement back in August saying that the government would continue to recognise the EU CE mark for many of products. Gove's department has instead opted to press ahead with replacing the CE mark with the UK CE mark for all construction projects sold in the UK from June of 2025. This mark incorporates the very same standards as the EU version, but only UK accredited testing facilities will be able to validate it. Blackham's sector technical manager in the UK explained that that means everything will need to be retested by a UK-based lab. And in their case, he says, we would have to be done for over 8 products at a cost of approximately £350,000 each. That's, again, a lot of money. The firm will also have to repeat fire testing at a cost of about £14,000 a product a month. He says it's the same standards to the same test method, the same everything, and it would all have to be paid for, ultimately by the customer, and for us to retest materials to a test that we have already done to a standard that we have already done it to, he says. So we are asking firms for this pointless check mark, which we've already done videos just about how redundant this mark already is. That the idea, of course, putting this forward was, oh, yes, this is going to be the new standard. This is going to set the new goals for like regulatory regimes around the world. Everyone will be changing their standards to match the UK CE mark. What a wonderful project that will be, except failing to recognize why the European mark is so popular and sets and why the EU is known as a regulatory superpower. It is big enough to be able to impose that. If you want to do business in Europe, you have to follow the mark, you have to follow the standards, you have to follow the rules and regulations. If you do not, well, your product can't be sold in Europe and you are missing out on this vast market you can have access to. Compared to the UK, it's not that big. So, back to it. The firm has said it has not yet made the final decision to go ahead, in the hope that, as in so many areas reciting to post-Brexit regulation, the government or its successor could change its mind. Where we are at the moment is where we are still waiting, hoping that there is some clink of common sense on the horizon, he says. But with the testing capacity currently at limited, it could take a very long time to take the plunge soon. A spokesperson for the Department of Levelling Up and Housing and Communities confirmed that the intention was not to recognise the CE mark from the June of 2025, but it added, saying, we are currently trying to reform the UK's construction product regime. We recognise the need to provide certainty for the sector, and we are carefully considering recommendations put forward by independent reviewers and will set out next steps in due course. Basically, that seems to me a statement from the government. We don't know what we're going to do. We don't know if we're actually going to keep these or not. And bear in mind, it's quite surprising that, you know, you've had Kimi Badenoch, who's in charge of the Department of Trade, sort of cancel this, where Gove, who in a lot of cases is very much a big backer of Kimi Badenoch, why he hasn't dropped this as well. Or whether he is somehow determined that this is going to become, he make his own Brexit benefit. Then he can come out and say, oh, look, Brexit benefit, everyone. I created a regime where every single UK company had to go forth, retest all their products, and waste all this massive amount of money. Aren't we great? Oh, my God. And again, maybe, as was said there, hopefully, maybe common sense will reign supreme. But with this current government, that's not very likely. So, Simon Shore, The chief executive of the Insulation Manufacturers Association said that the challenges faced by Rachel are being replicated in many other firms, saying that the unintended consequences are significant and incredibly damaging, he says. Most of the companies in my sector are European owned, and they do not want to produce a product to a different standard than one they do in mainland Europe. Which, as what we said from the beginning, no company wants to have two production lines. Having to have another production line is just an extra cost that they just do not want to have, because then you have to have, this is the Europe line made to the European standards, this is the UK line made to UK standards. They do not want to do that. And in many cases, those European companies, as we have seen constantly throughout all this, might just go, well, pointless being in the UK anymore. If we're going to be producing things to the UK standard, might as well shut down the UK production or shift it all over to somewhere in Europe. And as we've said many times, jobs, growth, companies, taxes, local councils relying on those business rates from those companies. It all goes. It's all interconnected. But as we said before, the Brexiteers love to talk about how business savvy they were in doing these things and how wonderful it would be to do these things. And yet every single time they've tried, they've failed, and have been told about the consequences. And yet they were told, or telling everyone during the Brexit referendum, that businesses wanted this. This is what businesses wanted. Well, time and time again, here we are here, and other videos that we've done and covered from many different businesses, from national, local, and regional newspapers who have had stories about local companies. Every single one has said, we do not want to deviate from Europe. We do not want to leave the single market. We do not want to leave the customs union. We do not want to go on this crazy deregulatory roller coaster that many of the Brexiteers now wanted to put on, which they were not advocating during the referendum for, well, obvious reasons. It's going to do huge, immense damage. And that's why when you've got the next Labour government coming in saying, we're going to do these side deals, which, again, the EU, not averse, has said it is not, doesn't want to do, that maybe we end up doing, a Swiss-style deal. And then eventually Starmer and Lammy can turn around and just basically say, as we've said all the time, this is Brexit, guys. This is as best as it's going to be. This is going to, even if we do continue on this is going to cause huge damage to our economy, and it is basically going to limit any growth opportunities that the UK is ever going to have. Are you sure you still want to do this? If not, let's just rejoin the customs union and, restart our journey back into the EU. Ultimately, that is what it is going to probably come down to. But probably not next Parliament, but maybe the one after. That's when we might start seeing maybe some action on that. But in the next Parliament, certainly we're going to see, obviously, sort of side deals done, working more closely with the EU, certainly probably closer in lockstep with them, doing things with sort of matching their sort of regulation when they're doing it, etc., etc. Ultimately, we're going to have, I think, a lot better relationship with Europe. And of course, as we've said many a time, a lot of these Brexiteers, and most of them in the Conservative Party, they're going to lose their seats. So they're going to be essentially on the outside complaining, and they ain't going to have a lot of power to do a damn thing about it. But hey, that's for maybe a video in the future. Who knows? Maybe next year. That, of course, depends when the general election happens. So let's get back to it. He also adds that there are now concerns about whether there is now testing capacity in the UK to underpin this new regime. I understand that there are some products that there is no test for in the UK. And therefore in theory, there will not be any eligibility to be placed on the UK market. And that is the seriousness of it. So you've got products that, again, fine for sale in Europe because they've got the capacity, they've got the test for it. But in the UK, there is no labs, there's no testing facility for it. And yet it can be sold in Europe, but because it can't be tested because we do not have the capacity for it, because we do not have the labs for it, it then can't be sold. Just it boggles the mind. It boggles the mind at these decisions. It honestly really does. And yet, construction, if we're going to be, building the next lot of, social housing estates, kind of important that we actually have, the materials and the construction capability to be able to do it. So certainly something I hope Labour's going to look at. So, in one sense, the experience of the construction products industry is an exception. The decision to stick with the CE marking for most sectors fitted the border push by Rishi Sunak's government to quietly smooth over the frictions with the EU by negotiating the Windsor Framework and governing trade with Northern Ireland, and of course, rejoining the Horizon scientific community, for example. And that is something that we said as well. When Sunak came in, there was a very clear tonal shift in the government's relation to the EU. By keeping the CE mark, as they said, they've sort of resolved most of these frictions by wanting to sort of deregulate. The Windsor Framework hasn't solved all the problems around that was meant to, it was meant to solve. But it was a start. It was a beginning, And to be honest, it's better than sort of keeping with what Boris Johnson put in place. But there you go. Like I say, not everything's going to be 100% perfect, but hey, at least he tried, and I think at least getting the Windsor Framework done, and smoothing some of over those frictions. Well, it was worth it, at least for the time being, until we can have to go back and more engage with the EU and just really recognize the reality of the UK that is now very much a mid-level power, and that it is very much a European country by its nature. And of course, engaging with Europe is far going to be better for its economy and growth needs and its place in the world. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that. It's just the reality. And as we always said, when Brexit meets reality, reality always wins. So, back to it. So, the plans to impose border checks and goods coming to the UK have been repeatedly delayed, though they are now due to come into force next month. Bear in mind, we will see. We will see if that happens, because remember, the government has literally at like the very last moment, we're talking like 2 to 3 weeks in some cases, has suddenly decided, oh, actually, no, we're going to kick the can down the road another year. Oh, we're going to kick the can down the road another year. So I am really skeptical, because bear in mind, these have been delayed over 6 times now. It would not shock me if we went to a 7th time. It would not shock me if we went to a 7th time. So, Active Divergence has more or less stopped, says Joe Ryland, who tracks the regulatory changes at the think tank UK in a Changing Europe. He says that the cost of living crisis has meant that bashing Brussels is no longer seen as good politics. What voters care about is the economy and inflation. And if you want to boost growth and control inflation, you don't want to be pushing that much divergence, because it is disruptive to businesses and it will potentially damages your trade. We are getting more aligned in some areas, agrees Stephen Phillipson, chief executive of the manufacturers group Made UK, citing the decision to rejoin the European scientific funding scheme Horizon and the 2035 date for phasing out petrol cars, which is now the same as in the EU after Sunak pushed it back. However, many goods exporters have already faced a battery of new tests and requirements since the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU came into force in the May of 2021. And the challenge is very much likely to continue as the EU regulations shift over time, what Rayland and his colleagues have called passive divergence. And this, of course, is going to be the ever increasing issue, that if you are going to, do more and more trade with the EU, then you've got to match with them. You've got to march in stock with them. And then at that point, it becomes the big question: if Brexit was all about going into this divergence, doing things differently in this areas as the Brexiteers, you know, championed, why are we continuing in lockstep? What was then the point of leaving the single market and customs union? Because remember, the Leave campaign championed at the time remaining in the single market and customs union. It was only after the referendum where the hardcore Brexiteers just pushed and pushed and pushed for an ever harder Brexit that was not put forward to voters. Because I still do believe that if they had been honest and said, actually, we are going to leave the single market and customs union, that they would not have won. Because remember, as Daniel Hanan infamously said, only a fool would leave the single market and customs union. Peter Kesh has just retired as the managing director for the Yorkshire-based fish food market World Feeds, which supplies aquariums and fish farms in many more than over 40 countries. And after the TCA rewrote the rules with trade with Europe, it took the firm a year before it could find a way of dealing with these checks and paperwork necessary for every shipment. Previously, the small firm would send its consignments via Groupage, where a logistics firm would take a mixed shipment from across the continent made up of many different products from different firms. And that's a big thing that is definitely affecting a lot of UK trade. Those small companies who can't afford to, if you see a big logistical lorry, they want it filled. But many of these small firms that do trade with Europe are not producing the volume to fill those lorries consistently. So groupage, able to group all those consignments together, was a massive benefit for our businesses. And now that's gone. And you have seen many photos of lorries like half empty or half full, depending on, depending on your how you look at it, I suppose. And that has cost firms huge amounts of money. Logistical groups as firms as well have also upped their cost because they know the cost of what this is to them as well. So we'll see if that ever gets changed, but I don't think that will change unless we rejoin the single market or well, at least the customs union. So carriers stopped offering, of course, this service once every crate from the UK had to be separately checked and accounted for. When you ship food into the EU, you now have to produce a health certificate, which is a very laborious matter. And you have to have a vet inspection of your products on site before they're shipped across. So there's all this rigmarole to get through, and it's costly. Yep, there's now a mass amount of cost. And another thing that we have said, it now makes UK products, UK companies, very much so far more uncompetitive on the continent. And if you're on the continent and you're like, well, we could buy this from the UK, but it costs, I don't know, 20 quid, or we could go to this Belgian company that's based in Belgium and it actually costs 10 quid. And that only cost is so high because of the extra logistical costs, the paperwork costs, and the time costs that is now needed to be able to send that shipment from the UK. Because, hey, they have to pass it on to the end consumer. That's where it always goes. So if you're now passing that end cost onto your consumer in Europe, well, they've got plenty of choice. They've got a lot more choice. So, World Feeds ultimately did find a solution, sending a half load of single UK to a single EU client who would then ship the individual orders onto other customers. So we've sort of managed to kind of get our marketplace back, but it took over a year to sort that out, and it's added over 30% of the cost to the product. What did we just say? Our customers have been very loyal to us, and it is a very special brand. It's the best fish food in the world, and people like it. But of course, you can only stretch the patience of elastics so far, and they won't wait because they've got to feed their fish. So we've been massively prejudiced by this, and it's just really sad. Again, not going to change on that. And like many other respondents to the British Chamber of Commerce annual survey on the TCA earlier this month, he says that the gap between the UK and the EU regulations is obviously likely to widen as the EU rules shift and the UK struggles to keep up, even if it wants to. And part of this, by the way, again, post Brexit, these bodies that the UK government was meant to replicate by the EU instead got absorbed into various different departments, and now they do not have the fully proper funded staff or departments to even keep up with this, because you need inspectors, you need clerks, you need administrators. This just has not happened. Why? Because they weren't interested in doing this. And of course, it has a large cost to it. And that's one of the reasons why we cannot keep up. If the UK wanted to, it could pass a bill saying that if the EU follows a regulation, because it would come through Parliament like it always did, and then we could have, a quick session of Parliament to pass it through. Again, like we always used to. Remember, we always massively, agreed with these EU rules and regulations. It weren't like we were continually disagreeing with them. There is stuff that, again, we could do and change to sort of help speed this up. But again, under this current government, not likely. Not likely at all. Then he continues. Food is hugely regulated, again, as it should be. And of course, it gets into ingredients that you can and then can't use. So you could ban an ingredient in the EU that we will be still using in the UK, which means you're going to have two separate products now because you can't sell the same one. As we always said, two production lines. That's a massive cost to companies that they just do not want to do. Perhaps because of these barriers such as these, the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility has suggested that the goods trade has been hit harder by Brexit than export services, which have performed very much in line with other G7 countries. Bear in mind, the only reason that we are in line with other G7 countries at the moment is because of inflation. If you take the inflation out of the export equation, we are lagging massively behind when it comes to exports. So there you go. Labour has, of course, promised to align the UK more closely with EU rules, seeking new agreements on veterinary standards, for example, and, of course, mutual recognition of professional standards. But such changes do appear unlikely to tackle the broader issues of the EU's regulatory system shifting further and further away from the UK's as rules are updated over time. And of course, that's the big problem. Keeping up with it. Can we do it? Yes, but it will be a constant race to sort of do so, unless we are, of course, in the customs union and we sort of go back to sort of when an EU rule comes forward, we can just slip it in, slip it through, as we used to do. That's the big problem, and we are going to end up as very much sort of lagging behind, and that's when it becomes potentially a problem. What if there is that EU change that does end up, especially with you can't use that ingredient in the EU, but you can in the UK, at least, and then a couple of months, we catch up and we catch up. And that's the problem, that we're going to be playing catch up on this when we really shouldn't be, especially when it is our largest export market. And of course, we do most of our trade with the EU, both back and forward. If we don't find a way to sort of solve these problems, again, the easiest way to do it, we join the customs union. Easiest, simple way solution to do it. But I don't think that's going to happen next Parliament. But as we've said, Parliament after that, that's where the potential becomes. So we are starting to get out of step, said Phillipson, and if we don't have the regulatory capacity to keep up, it's not intentional, but we are lagging behind. And that's where the problems are going to come in. that's where, again, our economy is going to become capped. That's where we're going to have massive economic problems, especially if we want to grow. Um, you know, growth, not the be all and end all of economics. I will agree, but having a growing economy, kind of an indicator to see how healthy your economy really is. So what's going to happen in the long term? Well, again, I hope we eventually do rejoin, the customs union or the single market. That is entirely possible, but it's not going to happen at least anytime soon. Um, Probably not in the next parliament, but as we said, after that and the one after that, that's when you will probably start to see more possibilities coming. You will start to see more and more businesses speaking out, especially on this. And one of the fun things could be, what if, bizarrely, the Conservative Party flips completely and becomes pro single market and customs union? That would be hilarious to see, but as a lot of people have said, might not be on the realms of possibility. Um, it would be hilarious, though, to see, especially when you've got some of the biggest advocates for doing that are actually um, diehard Remainers in the Conservative Party. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens in the future. But of course, these regulatory problems are not going to go away anytime soon. This is yet another problem we are going to be seeing constantly. And of course, covering again and again and again on this channel time after time. Because, regulations, as we said at the beginning, kind of important. Um, Something which the UK public basically didn't really pay attention to when we were in Europe. Just like, trade deals as well, something very similar. Also, the UK public's probably going to have to pay attention to as well. But of course, as always, we shall keep you up to date in what's going on in this area when stuff like this happens. And of course, if you want to keep up to date with that, remember to click the subscribe button and, of course, the like and share button as well. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.